The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Dr. Trent looked at her blankly and fumbled among his recollections. Mrs. Snake, said Valancy quietly. I was Miss Valancy Stirling when I came to you last May, over a year ago. I wanted to consult you about my heart. Dr. Trent's face cleared. Oh, of course, I remember now. I'm really not to blame for not knowing you. You've changed splendidly. And married. Well, it has agreed with you. You don't look much like an invalid now, eh? I remember that day. I was badly upset. Hearing about poor Ned bowled me over. But Ned's as good as new, and you, too, evidently. I told you so, you know. Told you there was nothing to worry over. Valancy looked at him. You told me, in your letter, she said slowly, with a curious feeling that someone else was talking through her lips, that I have angina pectoris, in the last stages, complicated with an aneurysm, that I might die any minute, that I couldn't live longer than a year. Dr. Trent stared at her. Impossible, he said blankly. I couldn't have told you that. Valancy took his letter from her bag and handed it to him. Miss Valancy Stirling, he read. Yes. Of course I wrote you, on the train, that night, but I told you there was nothing serious. Read your letter, insisted Valancy. Dr. Trent took it out, unfolded it, glanced over it. A dismayed look came into his face. He jumped to his feet and strode agitatedly about the room. Good heavens! This is the letter I meant for old Miss Jane Stirling. From Port Lawrence. She was here that day, too. I sent you the wrong letter. What unpardonable carelessness! But I was beside myself that night. My God, and you believe that? You believed... But you didn't... You went to another doctor. Valancy stood up, turned round, looked foolishly about her, and sat down again. I believed it, she said faintly. I didn't go to any other doctor. It would take too long to explain, but I believed I was going to die soon. Dr. Trent halted before her. I can never forgive myself. What a year you must have had! But you don't look... I can't understand. Never mind, said Valancy dully. And so there's nothing the matter with my heart? Well, nothing serious. You had what is called a pseudo-angina. It's never fatal, passes away completely with proper treatment, or sometimes with a shock of joy. Have you been troubled much with it? Not at all since March, answered Valancy. She remembered the marvelous feeling of recreation she had had when she saw Barney coming home safe after the storm. Had that shock of joy cured her? Then likely you're all right. I told you what to do in the letter you should have got, and of course I supposed you'd go to another doctor. Child, why didn't you? I didn't want anybody to know. Idiot, said Dr. Trent bluntly. I can't understand such folly. And poor old Miss Stirling. She must have got your letter, telling her there was nothing serious the matter. Well, it couldn't have made any difference. Her case was hopeless. Nothing that she could have done or left undone could have made any difference. I was surprised she lived as long as she did. 2 months. She was here that day, not long before you. I hated to tell her the truth. You think I'm a blunt old curmudgeon, and my letters are blunt enough. I can't soften things, but I'm a sniveling coward when it comes to telling a woman, face to face, that she's got to die soon. I told her I'd look up some features of the case I wasn't quite sure of, and let her know the next day. But you got her letter. Look here. Dear Miss Sterling. Yes, I noticed that, but I thought it a mistake. I didn't know there were any Stirlings in Port Lawrence. She was the only one, a lonely old soul, lived by herself with only a little home girl. She died 2 months after she was here, died in her sleep. My mistake couldn't have made any difference to her. But you, I can't forgive myself for inflicting a year's misery on you. It's time I retired, all right, when I do things like that, even if my son was supposed to be fatally injured. Can you ever forgive me? A year of misery? Valancy smiled a tortured smile as she thought of all the happiness Dr. Trent's mistake had bought her. But she was paying for it now. Oh, she was paying. If to feel was to live, she was living with a vengeance. She let Dr. Trent examine her and answered all his questions. When he told her she was fit as a fiddle and would probably live to be 100, she got up and went away silently. She knew that there were a great many horrible things outside waiting to be thought over. Dr. Trent thought she was odd. Anybody would have thought, from her hopeless eyes and woebegone face, that he had given her a sentence of death instead of life. Snaith? Snaith? Who the devil had she married? He had never heard of Snaiths in Deerwood. And she had been such a sallow, faded little old maid. Gad, but marriage had made a difference in her, anyhow, whoever Snaith was. Snaith? Dr. Trent remembered. That rapscallion Upback. Had Valancy Stirling married him? And her clan had let her? Well, probably that solved the mystery. She had married in haste and repented at leisure, and that was why she wasn't overjoyed at learning she was a good insurance prospect, after all. Married? To God knew whom. Or what? Jailbird? Defaulter? Fugitive from justice? It must be pretty bad if she had looked to death as a release, poor girl. But why were women such fools? Dr. Trent dismissed Valancy from his mind, though to the day of his death he was ashamed of putting those letters into the wrong envelopes. End of chapter 37. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Valancy walked quickly through the back streets and through Lover's Lane. She did not want to meet anyone she knew. She didn't want to meet even people she didn't know. She hated to be seen. Her mind was so confused, so torn, so messy. She felt that her appearance must be the same. She drew a sobbing breath of relief as she left the village behind, and found herself on the Upback Road. There was little fear of meeting anyone she knew here. The cars that fled by her with raucous shrieks were filled with strangers. One of them was packed with young people, who whirled past her singing uproariously, "My wife has the fever, oh then! My wife has the fever, oh then! My wife has the fever, oh I hope it won't leave her, for I want to be single again." Valancy flinched as if one of them had leaned from the car and cut her across the face with a whip. She had made a covenant with death, and death had cheated her. Now life stood mocking her. She had trapped Barney, trapped him into marrying her, and divorce was so hard to get in Ontario, so expensive, and Barney was poor. With life, fear had come back into her heart. Sickening fear. Fear of what Barney would think, would say. Fear of the future that must be lived without him. Fear of her insulted, repudiated clan. She had had one draught from a divine cup, and now it was dashed from her lips, with no kind, friendly death to rescue her. She must go on living and longing for it. Everything was spoiled, smirched, defaced. Even that year in the Blue Castle. Even her unashamed love for Barney. It had been beautiful because death waited. Now it was only sordid because death was gone. How could anyone bear an unbearable thing? She must go back and tell him. Make him believe she had not meant to trick him. She must make him believe that. She must say good-bye to her Blue Castle and return to the brick house on Elm Street. Back to everything she had thought left behind forever. The old bondage, the old fears. But that did not matter. All that mattered, now, was that Barney must somehow be made to believe she had not consciously tricked him. When Valancy reached the pines by the lake, she was brought out of her daze of pain by a startling sight. There, parked by the side of the old, battered, ragged Lady Jane, was another car. A wonderful car. A purple car. Not a dark royal purple, but a blatant, screaming purple. It shone like a mirror, and its interior plainly indicated the car caste of Vert de Vert. In the driver's seat sat a haughty chauffeur in livery, and in the tonneau sat a man who opened the door and bounced out nimbly as Valancy came down the path to the landing place. He stood under the pines waiting for her, and Valancy took in every detail of him. A stout, short, pudgy man, with a broad, rubicund, good-humored face, a clean-shaven face, though an unparalyzed little imp at the back of Valancy's paralyzed mind suggested the thought, such a face should have a fringe of white whisker around it. Old-fashioned, steel-rimmed spectacles on prominent blue eyes, a pursy mouth, a little round, knobby nose. Where, groped Valancy, had she seen that face before? It seemed as familiar to her as her own. The stranger wore a green hat and a light fawn overcoat over a suit of a loud check pattern. His tie was a brilliant green of lighter shade. On the plump hand he outstretched to intercept Valancy, an enormous diamond winked at her. But he had a pleasant fatherly smile, and in his hearty, unmodulated voice was a ring of something that attracted her. "Can you tell me, miss, if that house yonder belongs to Mr. Redfern? And if so, how can I get to it?" Redfern? A vision of bottles seemed to dance before Valancy's eyes. Long bottles of bitters, round bottles of hair tonic, square bottles of liniment, short, corpulent little bottles of purple pills, and all of them bearing that very prosperous, beaming moon face and steel-rimmed spectacles on the label. Dr. Redfern. "No," said Valancy faintly. "No, that house belongs to Mr. Snaith." Dr. Redfern nodded. "Yes, I understand Burney's been calling himself Snaith. Well, it's his middle name. Was his poor mother's. Bernard Snaith Redfern. That's him. And now, miss, can you tell me how to get over to that island? Nobody seems to be home there. I've done some waving and yelling. Henry there wouldn't yell. He's a one-job man. But old Doc Redfern can yell with the best of them yet, and ain't above doing it. Raised nothing but a couple of crows. Guess Burney's out for the day." "He was away when I left this morning," said Valancy. "I suppose he hasn't come home yet." She spoke flatly and tonelessly. This last shock had temporarily bereft her of whatever little power of reasoning had been left her by Dr. Trent's revelation. In the back of her mind the aforesaid little imp was jeeringly repeating a silly old proverb. It never rains, but it pours. But she was not trying to think. What was the use? Dr. Redfern was gazing at her in perplexity. "When you left this morning? Do you live over there?" He waved his diamond at the blue castle. "Of course," said Valancy stupidly. "I'm his wife." Dr. Redfern took out a yellow silk handkerchief, removed his hat, and mopped his brow. He was very bald, and Valancy's imp whispered, "Why be bald? Why lose your manly beauty? Try Redfern's hair vigor. It keeps you young." "Excuse me," said Dr. Redfern. "This is a bit of a shock." "Shocks seem to be in the air this morning." The imp said this out loud before Valancy could prevent it. "I didn't know Burney was married. I didn't think he would have got married without telling his old dad." Were Dr. Redfern's eyes misty? Amid her own dull ache of misery and fear and dread, Valancy felt a pang of pity for him. "Don't blame him," she said hurriedly. It wasn't his fault. It was all my doing." "You didn't ask him to marry you, I suppose," twinkled Dr. Redfern. He might have let me know. I'd have got acquainted with my daughter-in-law before this if he had. But I'm glad to meet you now, my dear, very glad. You look like a sensible young woman. I used to sort of fear Barney'd pick out some pretty bit of fluff just because she was good-looking. They were all after him, of course. Wanted his money, eh? Didn't like the pills and the bitters but liked the dollars, eh? Wanted to dip their pretty little fingers in old Doc's millions, eh? Millions? Said Valancy faintly. She wished she could sit down somewhere. She wished she could have a chance to think. She wished she and the Blue Castle could sink to the bottom of Mistawas and vanish from human sight forevermore. Millions, said Dr. Redfern complacently, and Burney chucks them for that. Again he shook the diamond contemptuously at the Blue Castle. Wouldn't you think he'd have more sense? And all on account of a white bit of a girl. He must have got over that feeling, anyhow, since he's married. You must persuade him to come back to civilization. All nonsense wasting his life like this. Ain't you going to take me over to your house, my dear? I suppose you've some way of getting there. Of course, said Valancy stupidly. She led the way down to the little cove, where the disappearing propeller boat was snuggled. Does your man want to come, too? Who, Henry? Not he. Look at him sitting there disapproving. Disapproves of the whole expedition. The trail up from the road nearly gave him a conniption. Well, it was a devilish road to put a car on. Whose old bus is that up there? Barney's. Good Lord! Does Barney Redfern ride in a thing like that? It looks like the great-great-grandmother of all the Fords. It isn't a Ford. It's a Gray Slauson, said Valancy spiritedly. For some occult reason, Dr. Redfern's good-humored ridicule of dear old Lady Jane stung her to life. A life that was all pain, but still life. Better than the horrible half-dead and half-aliveness of the past few minutes, or years. She waved Dr. Redfern curtly into the boat and took him over to the Blue Castle. The key was still in the old pine. The house still silent and deserted. Valancy took the doctor through the living room to the western veranda. She must at least be out where there was air. It was still sunny, but in the southwest a great thundercloud, with white crests and gorges of purple shadow, was slowly rising over Mistawas. The doctor dropped with a gasp on a rustic chair and mopped his brow again. Warm, eh? Lord, what of you? Wonder if it would soften Henry if he could see it. Have you had dinner? Asked Valancy. Yes, my dear. Had it before we left Port Lawrence. Didn't know what sort of wild hermit's hollow we were coming to, you see. Hadn't any idea I was going to find a nice little daughter-in-law here, all ready to toss me up a meal. Cats, eh? Puss, puss. See that? Cats love me. Bernie was always fond of cats. It's about the only thing he took from me. He's his poor mother's boy. Valancy had been thinking idly that Bernie must resemble his mother. She had remained standing by the steps, but Dr. Redfern waved her to the swing seat. Sit down, dear. Never stand when you can sit. I want to get a good look at Barney's wife. Well, well, I like your face. No beauty. You don't mind my saying that. You've sense enough to know it, I reckon. Sit down. Valancy sat down. To be obliged to sit when mental agony urges us to stride up and down is the refinement of torture. Every nerve in her being was crying out to be alone, to be hidden, but she had to sit and listen to Dr. Redfern, who didn't mind talking at all. When do you think Bernie will be back? I don't know. Not before night, probably. Where did he go? I don't know that either. Likely to the woods, up back. So he doesn't tell you his comings and goings either? Bernie was always a secretive young devil. Never understood him, just like his poor mother. But I thought a lot of him. It hurt me when he disappeared as he did. 11 years ago. I haven't seen my boy for 11 years. 11 years. Valancy was surprised. It's only 6 since he came here. Oh, he was in the Klondike before that, and all over the world. He used to drop me a line now and then, never give any clue to where he was, but just a line to say he was all right. I suppose he told you all about it. No, I know nothing of his past life, said Valancy with sudden eagerness. She wanted to know. She must know now. It hadn't mattered before. Now she must know all. And she could never hear it from Barney. She might never even see him again. If she did, it would not be to talk of his past. What happened? Why did he leave his home? Tell me, tell me. Well, it ain't much of a story. Just a young fool gone mad because of a quarrel with his girl. Only Bernie was a stubborn fool. Always stubborn. You never could make that boy do anything he didn't want to do. From the day he was born. Yet he was always a quiet, gentle little chap, too. Good as gold. His poor mother died when he was only 2 years old. I'd just begun to make money with my hair vigor. I'd dreamed the formula for it, you see. Some dream that. The cash rolled in. Bernie had everything he wanted. I sent him to the best schools. Private schools. I meant to make a gentleman of him. Never had any chance myself. Meant he should have every chance. He went through McGill. Got honors and all that. I wanted him to go in for law. He hankered after journalism and stuff like that. Wanted me to buy a paper for him, or back him in publishing what he called a real, worthwhile, honest-to-goodness Canadian magazine. I suppose I'd have done it. I always did what he wanted me to do. Wasn't he all I had to live for? I wanted him to be happy, and he never was happy. Can you believe it? Not that he said so, but I'd always a feeling that he wasn't happy. Everything he wanted, all the money he could spend, his own bank account, travel, seeing the world, but he wasn't happy, not till he fell in love with Ethel Traverse. Then he was happy for a little while. The cloud had reached the sun, and a great, chill, purple shadow came swiftly over Mistawis. It touched the blue castle, rolled over it. Valancy shivered. Yes, she said, with painful eagerness, though every word was cutting her to the heart. What was she like? Prettiest girl in Montreal, said Dr. Redfern. Oh, she was a looker, all right. Gold hair, shiny as silk, great, big, soft black eyes, skin like milk and roses. Don't wonder Bernie fell for her. And brains as well. She wasn't a bit of fluff. B.A. from McGill. A thoroughbred, too. One of the best families. But a bit lean in the purse, eh? Bernie was mad about her. Happiest young fool you ever saw. Then, the bust-up. What happened? Valancy had taken off her hat and was absently thrusting a pin in and out of it. Good Luck was purring beside her. Banjo was regarding Dr. Redfern with suspicion. Nip and Tuck were lazily cawing in the pines. Mistawis was beckoning. Everything was the same. Nothing was the same. It was 100 years since yesterday. Yesterday, at this time, she and Barney had been eating a belated dinner here with laughter. Laughter? Valancy felt that she had done with laughter forever. And with tears, for that matter. She had no further use for either of them. Blast if I know, my dear. Some fool quarrel, I suppose. Bernie just lit out. Disappeared. He wrote me from the Yukon. Said his engagement was broken and he wasn't coming back. And not to try to hunt him up because he was never coming back. I didn't. What was the use? I knew Bernie. I went on piling up money because there wasn't anything else to do. But I was mighty lonely. All I lived for was them little notes now and then from Bernie. Klondike, England, South Africa, China, everywhere. I thought maybe he'd come back some day to his lonesome old dad. Then 6 years ago even the letters stopped. I didn't hear word of or from him till last Christmas. Did he write? No, but he drew a check for $15,000 on his bank account. The bank manager is a friend of mine, one of my biggest shareholders. He'd always promised me he'd let me know if Bernie drew any checks. Bernie had $50,000 there, and he'd never touched a cent of it till last Christmas. The check was made out to Ainsley's, Toronto. Ainsley's? Valancy heard herself saying, Ainsley's? She had a box on her dressing table with the Ainsley trademark. Yes, the big jewelry house there. After I'd thought it over a while, I got brisk. I wanted to locate Bernie. Had a special reason for it. It was time he gave up his full hoboing and come to his senses. Drawing that 15 told me there was something in the wind. The manager communicated with the Ainsleys. His wife was an Ainsley, and found out that Bernard Redfern had bought a pearl necklace there. His address was given as Box 444, Port Lawrence, Muskoka, Ontario. First I thought I'd write. Then I thought I'd wait till the open season for cars and come down myself. Ain't no hand at writing. I've motored from Montreal. Got to Port Lawrence yesterday. Inquired at the post office. Told me they knew nothing of any Bernard Snaith Redfern, but there was a Barney Snaith, had a P.O. box there. Lived on an island out here, they said. So here I am. And where's Barney? Valancy was fingering her necklace. She was wearing $15,000 around her neck, and she had worried lest Barney had paid $15 for it and couldn't afford it. Suddenly she laughed in Dr. Redfern's face. Excuse me, it's so amusing, said poor Valancy. Isn't it? Said Dr. Redfern, seeing a joke, but not exactly hers. Now, you seem like a sensible young woman, and I dare say you've lots of influence over Bernie. Can't you get him to come back to civilization and live like other people? I've a house up there, big as a castle, furnished like a palace. I want company in it. Bernie's wife, Bernie's children. Did Ethel Traverse ever marry? Queried Valancy irrelevantly. Bless you, yes. 2 years after Bernie levanted. But she's a widow now, pretty as ever. To be frank, that was my special reason for wanting to find Bernie. I thought they'd make it up, maybe. But of course, that's all off now. Doesn't matter. Bernie's choice of a wife is good enough for me. It's my boy I want. Think he'll soon be back? I don't know, but I don't think he'll come before night. Quite late, perhaps. And perhaps not till tomorrow. But I can put you up comfortably. He'll certainly be back tomorrow. Dr. Redfern shook his head. Too damp. I'll take no chances with rheumatism. Why suffer that ceaseless anguish? Why not try Redfern's liniment? Quoted the imp in the back of Valancy's mind. I must get back to Port Lawrence before rain starts. Henry goes quite mad when he gets mud on the car. But I'll come back tomorrow. Meanwhile, you talk Bernie into reason. He shook her hand and patted her kindly on the shoulder. He looked as if he would have kissed her, with a little encouragement, but Valancy did not give it. Not that she would have minded. He was rather dreadful, and loud, and dreadful, but there was something about him she liked. She thought dully that she might have liked being his daughter-in-law if he had not been a millionaire. A score of times over, and Barney was his son, and heir. She took him over in the motorboat and watched the lordly purple car roll away through the woods with Henry at the wheel, looking things not lawful to be uttered. Then she went back to the Blue Castle. What she had to do must be done quickly. Barney might return at any moment, and it was certainly going to rain. She was thankful she no longer felt very bad. When you are bludgeoned on the head repeatedly, you naturally and mercifully become more or less insensible and stupid. She stood briefly like a faded flower bitten by frost, by the hearth, looking down on the white ashes of the last fire that had blazed in the Blue Castle. At any rate, she thought wearily, Barney isn't poor. He will be able to afford a divorce. quite nicely. End of chapter 38.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Section 39. She must write a note. The imp in the back of her mind laughed. In every story she had ever read, when a runaway life decamped from home she left a note, generally on the pincushion. It was not a very original idea, but one had to leave something intelligible. What was there to do but write a note? She looked vaguely about her for something to write with. Ink? There was none. Valancy had never written anything since she had come to the Blue Castle, save memoranda of household necessaries for Barney. A pencil sufficed for them, but now the pencil was not to be found. Valancy absently crossed to the door of Bluebeard's chamber and tried it. She vaguely expected to find it locked, but it opened unresistingly. She had never tried it before, and did not know whether Barney habitually kept it locked or not. If he did, he must have been badly upset to leave it unlocked. She did not realize that she was doing something he had told her not to do. She was only looking for something to write with. All her faculties were concentrated on deciding just what she would say and how she would say it. There was not the slightest curiosity in her as she went into the lean-to. There were no beautiful women hanging by their hair on the walls. It seemed a very harmless apartment, with a commonplace little sheet iron stove in the middle of it, its pipe sticking out through the roof. At one end was a table or counter crowded with odd-looking utensils, used no doubt by Barney in his smelly operations. Chemical experiments, probably, she reflected dully. At the other end was a big writing desk and swivel chair. The side walls were lined with books. Valancy went blindly to the desk. There she stood motionless for a few minutes, looking down at something that lay on it. A bundle of galley proofs. The page on top bore the title Wild Honey, and under the title were the words, by John Foster. The opening sentence, Pines are the trees of myth and legend. They strike their roots deep into the traditions of an older world, but wind and star love their lofty tops. What music when old Aeolus draws his bow across the branches of the pines. She had heard Barney say that one day when they walked under them. So Barney was John Foster. Valancy was not excited. She had absorbed all the shocks and sensations that she could compass for one day. This affected her neither one way nor the other. She only thought, so this explains it. It was a small matter that had, somehow, stuck in her mind more persistently than its importance seemed to justify. Soon after Barney had brought her John Foster's latest book, she had been in a Port Lawrence bookshop and heard a customer ask the proprietor for John Foster's new book. The proprietor had said curtly, "Not out yet. Won't be out till next week." Valancy had opened her lips to say, "Oh, yes, it is out," but closed them again. After all, it was none of her business. She supposed the proprietor wanted to cover up his negligence in not getting the book in promptly. Now she knew. The book Barney had given her had been one of the author's complimentary copies, sent in advance. Well, Valancy pushed the proofs indifferently aside and sat down in the swivel chair. She took up Barney's pen, and a vile one it was, pulled up a sheet of paper to her, and began to write. She could not think of anything to say except bald facts. Dear Barney, I went to Dr. Trent this morning and found out he had sent me the wrong letter by mistake. There never was anything serious the matter with my heart, and I am quite well now. I did not mean to trick you. Please believe that. I could not bear it if you did not believe that. I am very sorry for the mistake. But surely you can get a divorce if I leave you. Is desertion a ground for divorce in Canada? Of course, if there is anything I can do to help or hasten it, I will do it gladly, if your lawyer will let me know. I thank you for all your kindness to me. I shall never forget it. Think as kindly of me as you can, because I did not mean to trap you. Goodbye. Yours gratefully, Valancy. It was very cold and stiff, she knew, but to try to say anything else would be dangerous, like tearing away a dam. She didn't know what torrent of wild incoherences and passionate anguish might pour out. In a postscript she added, Your father was here today. He is coming back tomorrow. He told me everything. I think you should go back to him. He is very lonely for you. She put the letter in an envelope, wrote Barney across it, and left it on the desk. On it she laid the string of pearls. If they had been the beads she believed them, she would have kept them in memory of that wonderful year. But she could not keep the $15,000 gift of a man who had married her out of pity, and whom she was now leaving. It hurt her to give up her pretty bauble. That was an odd thing, she reflected. The fact that she was leaving Barney did not hurt her. Yet. It lay at her heart like a cold, insensible thing. If it came to life, Valancy shuddered and went out. She put on her hat and mechanically fed Good Luck and Banjo. She locked the door and carefully hid the key in the old pine. Then she crossed to the mainland in a disappearing propeller. She stood for a moment on the bank, looking at her blue castle. The rain had not yet come, but the sky was dark, and Mr. was grey and sullen. The little house under the pines looked very pathetic, a casket rifled of its jewels, a lamp with its flame blown out. I shall never again hear the wind crying over Mr. Wyss at night, thought Valancy. This hurt her, too. She could have laughed to think that such a trifle could hurt her at such a time. End of chapter 39. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Section 40. Valancy paused a moment on the porch of the brick house in Elm Street. She felt that she ought to knock like a stranger. Her rose bush, she idly noticed, was loaded with buds. The rubber plant stood beside the prim door. A momentary horror overcame her, a horror of the existence to which she was returning. Then she opened the door and walked in. I wonder if the prodigal son ever felt really at home again, she thought. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles were in the sitting-room. Uncle Benjamin was there, too. They looked blankly at Valancy, realizing at once that something was wrong. This was not the saucy, impudent thing who had laughed at them in this very room last summer. This was a gray-faced woman with the eyes of a creature who had been stricken by a mortal blow. Valancy looked indifferently around the room. She had changed so much, and it had changed so little. The same pictures hung on the walls. The little orphan who knelt at her never-finished prayer by the bed whereon reposed the black kitten that never grew up into a cat. The grey steel engraving of Quatre Bras, where the British regiment forever stood at bay. The crayon enlargement of the boyish father she had never known. There they all hung in the same places. The green cascade of Wandering Jew still tumbled out of the old granite saucepan on the window-stand. The same elaborate, never-used pitcher stood at the same angle on the sideboard shelf. The blue and gilt vases that had been among her mother's wedding presents still primly adorned the mantelpiece, flanking the china clock of bureaus and besprayed ware that never went. The chairs in exactly the same places. Her mother and Cousin Stickles, likewise unchanged, regarding her with stony unwelcome. Valancy had to speak first. "I've come home, Mother," she said tiredly. "So I see." Mrs. Frederick's voice was very icy. She had resigned herself to Valancy's desertion. She had almost succeeded in forgetting there was a Valancy. She had rearranged and organized her systematic life without any reference to an ungrateful, rebellious child. She had taken her place again in a society which ignored the fact that she had ever had a daughter and pitied her, if it pitied her at all, only in discreet whispers and asides. The plain truth was that, by this point, Mrs. Frederick did not want Valancy to come back, did not want ever to see or hear of her again. And now, of course, Valancy was here, with tragedy and disgrace and scandal trailing after her visibly. "So I see," said Mrs. Frederick. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm not going to die," said Valancy huskily. "God bless my soul," said Uncle Benjamin. "Who said you were going to die?" "I suppose," said Cousin Stickles shrewishly. Cousin Stickles did not want Valancy back either. "I suppose you've found out he has another wife, as we've been sure all along." "No, I only wish he had," said Valancy. She was not suffering particularly, but she was very tired. If only the explanations were all over, and she were upstairs in her old, ugly room, alone. Just alone. The rattle of the beads on her mother's sleeves, as they swung on the arms of the reed chair, almost drove her crazy. Nothing else was worrying her, but all at once it seemed that she simply could not endure that thin, insistent rattle. "My home, as I told you, is always open to you," said Mrs. Frederick stonily. "But I can never forgive you." Valancy gave a mirthless laugh. "I care very little for that if I could only forgive myself," she said. "Come, come," said Uncle Benjamin testily, but rather enjoying himself. He felt he had Valancy under his thumb again. "We've had enough of mystery. What has happened? Why have you left that fellow? No doubt there's reason enough, but what particular reason is it?" Valancy began to speak mechanically. She told her tale bluntly and barely. "A year ago, Dr. Trent told me I had angina pectoris and could not live long. I wanted to have some life before I died. That's why I went away, why I married Barney. And now I've found it is all a mistake. There is nothing wrong with my heart. I've got to live, and Barney only married me out of pity, so I have to leave him free." "God bless me," said Uncle Benjamin. Cousin Stickles began to cry. "Valancy, if only you had the confidence in your own mother—" Yes, I know," said Valancy impatiently. "What's the use of going into that now? I can't undo this year. God knows I wish I could. I've tricked Barney into marrying me, and he's really Bernard Redfern, Dr. Redfern's son of Montreal, and his father wants him to go back to him." Uncle Benjamin made a queer sound. Cousin Stickles took her black-bordered handkerchief away from her eyes and stared at Valancy. A queer gleam suddenly shot into Mrs. Frederick's stone-gray orbs. "Dr. Redfern? Not the purple pill man?" she said. Valancy nodded. "He's John Foster, too, the writer of those nature books." But... Mrs. Frederick was visibly agitated, though not over the thought that she was the mother-in-law of John Foster. "Dr. Redfern is a millionaire!" Uncle Benjamin shut his mouth with a snap. 10 times over," he said. Valancy nodded. "Yes, Barney left home years ago, because of some trouble, some disappointment. Now he will likely go back. So you see, I had to come home. He doesn't love me. I can't hold him to a bond he was tricked into." Uncle Benjamin looked incredibly sly. "Did he say so? Does he want to get rid of you?" "No. I haven't seen him since I found out. But I tell you, he only married me out of pity, because I asked him to, because he thought it would only be for a little while." Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles both tried to speak, but Uncle Benjamin waved a hand at them and frowned portentously. "Let me handle this." Wave and frown seemed to say. To Valancy, Well, dear, we'll talk it over later. You see, we don't quite understand everything yet. As Cousin Stickles says, you should have confided in us before. Later on, I dare say we can find a way out of this." "You think Barney can easily get a divorce, don't you?" said Valancy eagerly. Uncle Benjamin silenced with another wave the exclamation of horror he knew was trembling on Mrs. Frederick's lips. "Trust to me, Valancy. Everything will arrange itself. Tell me this, Dossie. Have you been happy up back? Was Mr. Redfern good to you?" "I have been very happy, and Barney was very good to me," said Valancy, as if reciting a lesson. She remembered when she studied grammar at school, she had disliked the past and perfect tenses. They had always seemed so pathetic. "I have been—" It was all over and done with. "Then don't worry, little girl." How amazingly paternal Uncle Benjamin was. "Your family will stand behind you. We'll see what can be done." "Thank you," said Valancy, dully. Really, it was quite decent of Uncle Benjamin. "Can I go and lie down a little while? I'm tired." "Of course you're tired." Uncle Benjamin patted her hand gently. Very gently. "All worn out and nervous. Go and lie down, by all means. You'll see things in quite a different light after you've had a good sleep." He held the door open. As she went through, he whispered, "What is the best way to keep a man's love?" Valancy smiled wanly, but she had come back to the old life, the old shackles. "What?" she asked as meekly as of yore. "Not to return it," said Uncle Benjamin with a chuckle. He shut the door and rubbed his hands, nodded, and smiled mysteriously round the room. "Poor little Doss," he said pathetically. "Do you really suppose that Snaith can actually be Dr. Redfern's son?" gasped Mrs. Frederick. "I see no reason for doubting it. She says Dr. Redfern has been there. Why, the man is rich as wedding cake. Amelia, I've always believed there was more in Doss than most people thought. You kept her down too much, repressed her. She never had a chance to show what was in her. And now she's landed a millionaire for a husband." "But," hesitated Mrs. Frederick, they told terrible tales about him." "All gossip and invention, all gossip and invention. It's always been a mystery to me why people should be so ready to invent and circulate slanders about other people they know absolutely nothing about. I can't understand why you paid so much attention to gossip and surmise. Just because he didn't choose to mix up with everybody, people resented it. I was surprised to find what a decent fellow he seemed to be that time he came into the store with Valancy. I discounted all the yarns then and there." "But he was seen dead drunk in Port Lawrence once," said Cousin Stickles, doubtfully, yet as one very willing to be convinced to the contrary. "Who saw him?" demanded Uncle Benjamin truculently. "Who saw him? Old Jemmy Strang said he saw him. I wouldn't take old Jemmy Strang's word on oath. He's too drunk himself half the time to see straight. He said he saw him lying drunk on a bench in the park. Pshaw! Redfern's been asleep there. Don't worry over that."
But his clothes and that awful old car, said Mrs. Frederick uncertainly. Eccentricities of genius, declared Uncle Benjamin. You heard Doss say he was John Foster? I'm not up in literature myself, but I heard a lecturer from Toronto say that John Foster's books had put Canada on the literary map of the world. I suppose we must forgive her, yielded Mrs. Frederick. Forgive her? Uncle Benjamin snorted. Really, Amelia was an incredibly stupid woman. No wonder poor Doss had gone sick and tired of living with her. Well, yes, I think you'd better forgive her. The question is, will Snaith forgive us? What if she persists in leaving him? You've no idea how stubborn she can be, said Mrs. Frederick. Leave it all to me, Amelia. Leave it all to me. You women have muddled it enough. This whole affair has been bungled from start to finish. If you had put yourself to a little trouble years ago, Amelia, she would not have bolted over the traces as she did. Just let her alone. Don't worry her with advice or questions till she's ready to talk. She's evidently run away in a panic because she's afraid he'd be angry with her for fooling him. Most extraordinary thing of Trent to tell her such a yarn. That's what comes of going to strange doctors. Well, we mustn't blame her too harshly, poor child. Redfern will come after her. If he doesn't, I'll hunt him up and talk to him as man to man. He may be a millionaire, but Valancy is a Stirling. He can't repudiate her just because she was mistaken about her heart disease. Not likely he'll want to. Doss is a little overstrung. Bless me, I must get in the habit of calling her Valancy. She isn't a baby any longer. Now, remember, Amelia, be very kind and sympathetic. It was something of a large order to expect Mrs. Frederick to be kind and sympathetic, but she did her best. When supper was ready, she went up and asked Valancy if she would like a cup of tea. Valancy, lying on her bed, declined. She just wanted to be left alone for a while. Mrs. Frederick left her alone. She did not even remind Valancy that her plight was the outcome of her own lack of daughterly respect and obedience. One could not exactly say things like that to the daughter-in-law of a millionaire. End of chapter 40.